The wind in Dustfall Flats had teeth, and it gnawed on the silence. It was a high, lonely sound that scraped across salt-caked hills and worried the loose boards of the general store. It was the only welcome Mara Quinn received. She stood in the center of the town's single, dusty thoroughfare, a place that was less a street and more a scar on the face of the earth. At 22, she had been away for 6 long years, sent east for an education her grandmother had insisted upon. But the town's memory was longer and far less forgiving than that. Her worn leather boots were coated in the pale dust of her long journey, the hem of her dark blue traveling skirt frayed and tired. But it wasn't her clothes or the exhaustion etched onto her fine-boned face that stopped the town. It was the object hanging from a simple leather cord she had wrapped, for safekeeping, around her wrist, a silver pendant, tarnished with age, shaped like the seed of a cottonwood tree. It wasn't large, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone in the dry afternoon air. Her grandmother's last instruction, whispered on a deathbed that smelled of lavender and regret, had been simple. Take it back. Mara, return what was borrowed from the earth. The town stared. It was a collective, unblinking gaze that felt physical, like a pressure against her skin. From the porch of the saloon, a man stopped his whittling, his knife still. From the gaping maw of the blacksmith's forge, the hammer's rhythm ceased. Women, sweeping dust from their porches, held their brooms motionless. Eyes followed her, hard eyes that remembered grief and assigned it a shape. And that shape was the silver pendant now glinting dully in the low sun. A dog, a scrawny thing with its ribs showing, began to bark from under a wagon. The sound was sharp, frantic. It was answered by the hollow, discordant clanking of cowbells from a nearby pen, a sound that usually meant life and commerce but now sounded like the rattling of bones. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of her dark brown hair across her face. She tucked it back, her fingers trembling slightly. "You brought that thing back." The voice was a man's, rough as burlap, coming from the shadows of the livery stable. It wasn't a question so much as an accusation. It was the first stone thrown, and it broke the dam of silence. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a low, guttural sound of fear and anger that had been simmering for years. Then came the shriek. It came from the doorway of the granary, a place that smelled of mice and dry rot. Elspeth Miller, a woman whose face was a roadmap of past sorrows, stood there, her body as thin and brittle as a dead branch. Her bony finger shot out, pointing directly at Mara, at the pendant. "The bad omen has returned," she rasped, her voice a crackle of dry leaves. "She's brought the curse back to our door." Elspeth stumbled backward into the shadows of her store as if struck, and her panic was a contagion. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals, now fused into a single entity, a mob moved by a singular, primal terror. The whispers became shouts. The stares became glares filled with a righteous hatred. They had found the source of their pain, the vessel for their long-nursed bitterness. It was this girl, this ghost from the past, with the devil's own silver tied to her wrist. 2 men broke from the crowd. They were miners, identifiable by the stoop in their shoulders and the coal dust permanently ground into the lines of their faces. Jed and Silas. Mara remembered them as boys who used to steal apples from her grandmother's single, struggling tree. Now their faces were hard, their eyes hollowed out by loss. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their purpose was clear in the grim set of their jaws. They seized her arms, rough canvas hands clamped down on her biceps, the grip merciless. A cry of surprise and fear caught in Mara's throat. She tried to pull away, to reason with them, but it was like trying to reason with a rock slide. They were stronger, fueled by a fear that had been festering in the dark for years. They dragged her. Her feet scrambled for purchase on the loose dirt, the heel of her boot catching and nearly twisting her ankle. The world became a jarring blur of dust and sky, of contorted, shouting faces that swam at the edge of her vision. Her cheek scraped against the unforgiving earth as she stumbled, the sting of it a sharp counterpoint to the growing dread in her chest. They were pulling her past the last of the town's buildings, toward the fallow fields that stretched out toward the foothills. Their destination was a single, blackened post standing alone in the middle of a dead wheat field. The wood was ancient, weathered to the color of old bone and charred by a fire long ago. It was the town's monument to its own fear, the place where they had dealt with another bad omen a generation before. It was a place of sacrifice. They shoved her against it, the rough wood digging into her back through the thin fabric of her dress. One of the men, Silas, produced a length of rope and began to bind her wrists, pulling the knots so tight they bit into her skin. Jed, meanwhile, took a sack from his belt. Salt. He began to walk in a wide circle around her and the post, pouring a thick white line onto the dead earth. A folk magic barrier meant to contain evil, to sanctify the ground for what was to come. The rest of the town followed, forming a wider circle around the salt. They carried lanterns now, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky. The flames swayed and danced, casting long, monstrous shadows that capered and writhed on the ground. The light was unsteady, uncertain. It seemed half meant to illuminate, and half meant to ignite. A low chanting began, a discordant mix of desperate prayers and bitter curses. They were pleading to God for deliverance while condemning her to hell in the same breath. From the ridge overlooking the valley, Calder Rook watched the scene unfold. At 36, he had the stillness of a man who had made his peace with grief, which was to say, he had buried it so deep it had become part of his foundation. He sat atop his horse, a powerful roan named Fury, whose stillness mirrored his own. His hands, calloused and strong, rested on the saddle horn, but his right hand was clenched around the leather reins, his knuckles showing white through the tanned skin. He had lost everything to the story that was now coiling around that girl. The Mine Curse, they called it, a convenient name for the groaning shift of earth that had claimed the No. 3 shaft 5 years ago. It had taken his wife, Ilara, who had been delivering lunch to her brother, and it had taken his son, 6-year-old Samuel, who had tagged along, his pockets full of shiny rocks. Calder hadn't lost them to sickness or an act of God. He'd lost them to a story, a whisper of bad luck and dark dealings that had allowed shoddy timbering and greedy shortcuts to go unquestioned. After the collapse, the town needed a reason, a villain simpler than negligence. They found one in the old tales, in the land itself, and in anyone who didn't fit in. Now, watching the firelight glint off the salt circle below, he saw history pulling the trigger on itself. He saw the same terrified faces, heard the same desperate prayers. Fear was a patient predator, and when it grew old and powerful enough, it learned to dress itself in the robes of a god. It demanded sacrifice. It promised purification, and it always chose a victim who couldn't fight back. His first instinct, the one that had ruled him for 5 years, was to turn Fury around and ride back to the empty silence of his ranch. It wasn't his fight. His heart was a crater, and nothing could grow there anyway. Let them have their blood. What was one more ghost in a town already haunted? But then he saw the girl straighten her back against the post. He saw the faint glint of silver at her wrist. He saw not a witch, but a girl of 22, alone and terrified. And he saw his son, Samuel, in his mind's eye, holding up a piece of fool's gold, his face alight with wonder. The town's fear had buried that light forever. It was about to extinguish another. If I stay quiet, Calder thought, the words forming cold and clear in his mind, there'll be another grave tonight. And the thought was unbearable. The crater of his heart ached with a pain he had forgotten was there. It was the phantom limb of his own humanity. Down in the field, the crowd's fervor was reaching its peak. A man held a torch forward, its flame licking at the air, hungry. They were seconds away from a decision that could never be undone. And then, a voice cut through the clamor. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream for mercy or a cry of defiance. It was weak, threaded with pain, but it carried an impossible clarity. It was Mara. "If you burn me," she asked, her voice trembling but audible in a sudden lull, "will you sleep soundly?" The question struck the crowd like a physical blow. It didn't challenge their strength or their conviction. It slipped past their armor of righteous fear and aimed directly at the small, secret part of them that would have to live with the morning. The man with the torch froze. A woman's prayer faltered on her lips. For the first time, a flicker of doubt, of individual conscience, entered their eyes. The mob hesitated, becoming for a moment just a collection of tired, frightened people in a dead field. The pause was no longer than a single indrawn breath, but it was enough. It was enough for hope to slip in, thin and sharp as the edge of a knife, and on the ridge. It was enough for Calder Rook to spur his horse forward. The shot was not the crack of a hunter's rifle, nor the sharp report of a duel. It was a roar, a deliberate and deafening blast that tore through the fabric of the evening. It aimed at nothing but the thickening delusion in the air, and it hit its mark. The flash from the muzzle was a brief, violent star that illuminated the contorted faces of the mob, freezing them for a split second in a tableau of righteous fury. Then came the sound, a physical wave that slapped the prayers and curses from their lips, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Into that silence rode Calder Rook. He didn't charge. Fury, his powerful roan, moved with a controlled, ground-eating canter that was more intimidating than any wild gallop. The horse's hooves were muffled by the dusty earth until they crossed the white line of salt. The sound of them crunching over the crystals was a desecration of the mob's crude ritual, a deliberate trampling of their superstition. Calder brought the horse to a halt inside the circle, placing himself and the animal's solid mass between Mara and the crowd. He was a silhouette against the dying light, a figure carved from the granite of the surrounding hills. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When he spoke, the words were low and steady, imbued with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded the land, his livestock, and his own profound grief for years. The sound carried across the field, cutting through the fear. Let her go. The words hung in the air, simple, absolute. It wasn't a request. It was an order. For a moment, no one moved. The spell of the mob, broken by the gunshot, now faced a new and more formidable power, the will of a single, determined man. All eyes shifted from Mara to Calder. They saw a man they knew, a man who had suffered as they had, yet he was not one of them. He stood apart, his face a mask of grim resolve in the lantern light. The torchbearer, a nervous man named Abel whose farm bordered Rook's land, was the closest. His hand, which had been so steady moments before, began to tremble violently. The lantern in his other hand shook, and a small, dark droplet of kerosene dripped from the spout onto the parched earth. It was followed by another, and another, forming a small, dark stain at his feet. A sharp, oily smell rose into the air, the scent of fuel and fire. That smell was a ghost. It was the scent of the lamps the miners carried into the earth. It was the smell that had clung to the rescue party that brought the bodies out of the No. 3 Shaft 5 years ago. It was the smell of tragedy, a potent reminder of the very disaster they were trying to exorcise. A woman in the back of the crowd gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Another man took an involuntary step back. The scent didn't purify, it implicated. It reminded them that their grief was rooted not in silver pendants, but in dirt and rock and splintered timber. Abel stared at the spreading stain, his face pale. His righteous anger was evaporating, leaving behind a sick, hollow feeling. He looked at Calder, then at the girl tied to the post, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not an omen, but a young woman, her eyes wide with terror. Calder saw the hesitation, the crumbling foundation of their certainty. He raised his pistol again, this time pointing it directly at the star-dusted sky. He fired a second time. The sound was even greater than the first, a sharp crack that echoed off the high rock faces of the valley. The report bounced back and forth, a volley of invisible cannonballs that seemed to shake the very ground. It was the voice of the mountains themselves, a final, definitive judgment on the night's proceedings. That was all it took. The mob didn't run. It dissolved, Like a flock of startled birds, they broke apart, their shared purpose shattered. The first to turn was Elspeth Miller, the granary owner who had incited them. She pulled her shawl tight around her bony shoulders and scurried back toward the town, her face a mask of shame and renewed fear. Others followed, their heads down, their lanterns casting jittery pools of light on the ground as they retreated. They shuffled away in twos and threes, avoiding Calder's gaze, avoiding Mara's, avoiding each other's. The collective monster had broken back down into its constituent parts, fearful, superstitious men and women who would have to face the dawn with the memory of what they had almost done. In less than a minute, the field was empty, save for the blackened post, the circle of salt, and the two figures within it. Calder dismounted, his boots making a soft thud on the ground. The air was suddenly quiet. The only sounds the soft nicker of his horse and the ragged, shallow breaths Mara was trying to draw into her lungs. He walked toward her, his movements economical and sure. He pulled a heavy skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade gleamed in the faint moonlight. Mara flinched, her body tensing against the post. He didn't speak. He simply reached behind her and, with one swift, clean slice, severed the rope binding her wrists. The tension gone, her arms fell limply to her sides. She swayed, her legs threatening to buckle after being held rigid for so long. Calder sheathed his knife and caught her elbow, his grip strong and steadying. He gently took her hands to examine the damage. The coarse rope had chafed her skin raw. Angry red welts circled her wrists, and in several places, the skin was broken, tiny beads of blood welling up on the surface. It was the mark of their ritual, the physical price of their collective terror, disguised as salvation. He took a clean kerchief from his pocket and carefully blotted the blood. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up with the sudden reversal of her fate. She had been preparing to die, and now she was standing here, breathing the cool night air, supported by the hand of a stranger. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a hoarse whisper. "Why did you save me?" Calder finished tending to her wrists before he met her gaze. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, deep and shadowed. He wasn't looking at her as a man looks at a woman, but as a prospector might look at a strange new stone, wondering what secrets it held. "To give the truth a chance to open its mouth," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of sentiment. He released her elbow, turning to his horse. "Can you ride?" She nodded. Though she wasn't entirely sure it was true, her entire body felt like a single, throbbing bruise. He offered his cupped hands as a stirrup. With a surge of effort, she placed her boot in his hands and he lifted her easily onto the saddle, settling her in front of him. He swung up behind her, taking the reins in one hand and placing the other lightly on her waist to steady her. The warmth of his body through his leather vest was a startling, solid presence after the cold terror. They rode away from the salt field, leaving the lonely post to stand guard over the dead wheat. Calder urged Fury not toward the town, but onto a narrow, winding trail that led up into the hills, a path cloaked in the deep shadows of ancient pine trees. The world shrank, the vast, open sky replaced by a canopy of dark branches. The night became a close, intimate thing. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the saddle leather, the soft puff of the horse's breath, and Mara's own quiet, shuddering inhalations. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The shock of the ordeal was beginning to settle deep into Mara's bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. She shivered, leaning back slightly against Calder's chest. Her mind was a chaotic swirl of shouting faces, flickering flames, and the biting grip of the rope. Fragments of memory surfaced and submerged, her grandmother's frail hand in hers, the weight of the silver pendant, the long dusty road to Dustfall Flats. And then, other words. Words from the letter her grandmother had pressed into her hand along with the pendant, a final, cryptic postscript, written in a shaky, fading hand. The words had been swimming in her head for weeks, and now, in her dazed and exhausted state, they surfaced, slipping from her lips in a voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the wind. "Go deeper, make it quick inside." She wasn't speaking to him. She was speaking to the ghosts in her own mind. The words were a disjointed murmur, the fragment of a fever dream. But Calder heard them, every syllable. He went still behind her, his hand on her waist tightening for a fraction of a second. The horse continued its steady climb. But the man on its back had frozen in time. The words echoed in his mind, nonsensical and yet terrifyingly familiar. They were a key turning in a lock he had long since forgotten was there. He frowned, his brow furrowed in the darkness. What could she possibly mean? The phrase was an echo of the whispers that had haunted the town since the collapse, the superstitious nonsense the miners muttered about the mountain wanting something from them. But her words were specific, urgent. Inside what he thought, his mind racing. The mine. The image of the No-3 shaft's collapsed entrance, a gaping wound in the hillside, flashed in his mind. The thought of going back there, of digging into that tomb, sent a wave of cold dread through him. But the phrase was more complex than that. Make it quick inside. It wasn't just about location, it was about intimacy, about a hidden space. He thought of the secrets the town kept, the lies buried beneath the surface of daily life. The words could mean anything. They could be a metaphor, or a man's heart. The question rose unbidden from the deepest part of him, from the crater where his own heart used to be, a place he had sealed off, shored up with silence and hard work. The idea that this girl, this stranger, could speak a phrase that touched upon that buried pain was deeply unsettling. He had saved her to find the truth, and now it seemed the truth was a far more complicated and dangerous thing than he had imagined. They cleared the pine forest, and the trail opened onto a high ridge overlooking the valley. The lights of Dustfall Flats were a small, scattered handful of embers below them. But ahead, further down the other side of the ridge, was another light, a single, steady point of gold in the vast, velvet darkness. It was the lamp he had left burning in the window of his ranch house. For Mara, the light was a promise of safety, a haven after the storm. But for Calder, it was something else entirely. It was a furnace. It was the place where his memories were forged, where the past was a constant, living presence in the empty rooms. The sight of it brought him no comfort, only a grim acceptance. He had brought the catalyst for change to his own doorstep. He had ridden into the circle to stop a fire, only to find he had carried a burning ember home with him. The kitchen in Calder Rook's ranch house was a small fortress against the night. The air was thick with the honest smells of his life-worn leather from the saddle he was mending on a stand in the corner, the sharp, clean scent of pine smoke from the stone fireplace, and the faint, underlying aroma of coffee and old iron. It was a room built for one, a space pared down to essentials, and Mara's presence in it was as loud as a shout in a library. He said nothing as he guided her to a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth. The firelight danced across her pale, dirt-streaked face, making canyons of the shadows under her eyes. He moved with a quiet efficiency, fetching a basin of warm water and a clean strip of linen from a chest. He draped a heavy wool blanket, smelling faintly of horse and hay, over her shoulders. The weight of it was a comfort, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She watched his hands as he worked. They were large, competent hands, the knuckles scarred and the palms calloused from years of wrestling with rope, wood, and iron. He cleaned the raw abrasions on her wrists with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his grim expression. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task, as if patching her wounds was no different from mending a fence line. He propped her wrists on a folded piece of clean cloth on the table, the simple gesture a small island of care in an ocean of hostility. As he finished, the leather cord around her wrist, now dark with water, slipped loose. The silver pendant slid onto the scarred surface of the oak table, landing with a soft, metallic click. In the flickering glow of the fire, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The tarnish couldn't hide the two letters crudely engraved on its surface, worn nearly smooth by time and touch. A C. Mara stared at them, the initials of a ghost she'd been sent to find. She looked up at Calder, who was now stoking the fire, his back to her. His silence was a wall she had to try and climb. "C," she said, her voice still hoarse. "Who was a C?" For a long moment, Calder didn't move. He continued to nudge a log with the iron poker, the scrape of metal on wood the only answer. Then he straightened up, placing the poker back on its hook. He turned, but his eyes didn't meet hers. They looked past her, at the dark window where their reflections were faint and ghostly against the blackness of the night. He walked to the counter and poured a dipper of water into a tin cup, his movements slow and deliberate. "Some folks," he said, his voice a low rumble, "when they bury something, they don't use a shovel, they use a story." He placed the cup of water on the table in front of her. A C was someone who buried something deep and nailed the coffin shut with a lie. The cool metal of the cup felt good against her trembling fingers. She took a sip, the water tasting of the well, clean and cold. His words were a riddle, but they resonated with a deep, unsettling truth. A lie. The town had nearly killed her for a story. As the water soothed her throat, the throbbing in her wrists seemed to intensify, sending a fresh wave of pain up her arms. The pain was a key, unlocking a part of her memory that shock had slammed shut. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was no longer in the warm kitchen, but back in the stuffy, lavender-scented bedroom in her grandmother's house in Boston. She could feel the frail, papery hand of the dying woman pressing the pendant into her own, and she could see the letter. A single sheet of paper, covered in a spidery, fading script. Most of it had been recollections, loving words, and final goodbyes. But the last lines, the very last instructions, had been different. They were urgent, a final command from beyond the grave. "Return what was borrowed from the earth." Her grandmother had written, "The key is not for a door, but for a memory. It opens the place of the last shadow." And then, underlined 3 times, was the cryptic phrase, followed by a crude drawing of the mine's entrance with an X marking the 3rd shaft. "Go deeper. Make it quick inside. Mine shaft, no, 3. Mara's eyes flew open. The haze of exhaustion and fear that had fogged her mind since she'd arrived in Dustfall Flats was finally clearing. The phrase she had mumbled on the trail, the words that had sounded like a feverish plea, suddenly snapped into focus. They weren't a random utterance. They were a cipher, an instruction. She looked at Calder, and for the first time since he'd pulled her onto his horse, he saw a fire ignite in her eyes. It was not the wild, panicked fire of a cornered animal, but the steady, focused flame of purpose. "It wasn't a feeling," she said, her voice gaining strength, becoming clear and sharp. "The words I said on the trail. Go deeper. Make it quick inside. It's from my grandmother's letter. It's a code." She leaned forward, her intensity pulling his gaze to hers, holding it. "It means to dig. Dig deep, and do it quickly. Inside mine shaft number 3. The name hit the quiet room like a physical blow. Mine shaft no, 3. The name was a curse in itself, a synonym for death and grief in this valley. It was the wound that had never healed. It was the tomb of Calder Rook's life. He froze. Not a muscle in his body moved. The hand that had been resting on the back of his chair clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the ghosts of the 5 years that had passed since that name had meant anything other than sorrow. That was where Ilara had died. That was where his son, Samuel, his bright, 6-year-old boy, had been crushed under 1,000 tons of rock and lies. His first impulse was a violent, primal urge to protect the sanctity of that pain. He wanted to shout at her, to grab her by the arm and throw her out of his house, back into the night, back to the wolves that had tried to devour her. How dare she? How dare this stranger, this catalyst of chaos, come into his home and speak the name of his son's grave? How dare she suggest they defile it? Dig into it. Based on the ramblings of a dead woman and a piece of tarnished silver, the curse had taken his family. That was the story. That was the coffin, nailed shut. He opened his mouth to tell her to go. The words were on his tongue, hot and bitter. But he made the mistake of looking into her eyes. He didn't see madness there. He didn't see a woman lost in grief or delusion. He saw a deep, unwavering, and utterly stubborn belief. Her gaze was clear and direct. She was not asking him for a favor. She was presenting him with a fact. She believed every word she was saying with a certainty that was as solid and real as the stone mountain outside. In her eyes, he saw a woman who had been dragged to a post and nearly burned alive, yet who had found the strength to hold on to this one. Strange truth. She wasn't an omen. She was a messenger, and the message was aimed directly at the heart of his own long-buried agony. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the soft pop and hiss of the logs settling in the fireplace. From outside, a loose shutter on a barn window, one he'd been meaning to fix for years, began to bang against the clapboard in the rising wind. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow, relentless rhythm, like a drumbeat counting down the seconds, or a clock counting down the years. He finally moved, turning away from her to stand before the hearth, staring into the flames. He was seeing not the fire, but the darkness of the mine. He was seeing his son's face, smiling, holding up a rock he'd found. He had blamed the mountain. He had blamed God. He had blamed the bad luck Elspeth Miller and the others had whispered about. He had blamed everything except the possibility that it was all just a lie. He had chosen the story over the truth because the story, at least, gave his pain a grand, terrible meaning. The truth might leave it with no meaning at all. Or, worse, a meaning he could not bear. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were being scraped from the bottom of a dry well. He did not turn to look at her. He spoke to the fire, to the ghosts in the room. "We go to the mine." He finally turned, and his eyes were like chips of flint. "If the truth wants to breathe," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet kitchen, "we'll open the earth's chest." Later that night, long after Mara had fallen into an exhausted sleep in the small guest cot by the fire, Calder lay awake in his own bed. He stared into the darkness, listening to the wind howl and the shutter bang its ceaseless rhythm. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a peaceful void. It was a dark, suffocating tunnel. He dreamed he was underground, not with a shovel, but with a heavy, steam-powered drill. The engine roared, the bit chewing through solid rock, the vibrations shaking his entire body. He drilled for what felt like an eternity, driven by a desperate, nameless urgency. And then, the sound changed. The grinding roar of the bit against stone was replaced by a high, shrieking scrape, metal on metal. He stopped the drill. In the sudden, ringing silence of his dream, he reached out a trembling hand into the darkness of the borehole. His fingers touched something cold, square, and unyielding. It was not rock. It was something that had been hidden, something that had been buried on purpose. And in that moment, a sound erupted from his own throat, a sound he hadn't made in 5 years, not at the funeral, not in the long, empty nights since. It was a sob, a raw, ragged, tearing sound of a grief so profound it had been petrified into silence. It was the sound of the first crack in the tomb he had built around his own heart. The dawn broke not with color but with a slow dilution of the dark, turning the sky the color of old pewter. A hard gray light fell over Dustfall Flats, revealing a world leached of warmth. The path leading up to the abandoned mines was not dirt but a pale, sterile track of crushed salt rock that crunched under the hooves of Calder's horse. It was the road to a dead place, and the air itself felt thin and brittle. They stopped before the entrance to mine shaft No. 3. It was less a doorway and more a wound in the hillside, a jagged mouth choked with fallen rock and debris from the collapse 5 years prior. The heavy timber frame that had once supported the entrance was now a skeleton of rotting wood, sagging inward as if weary of holding up the weight of the mountain's grief. The years of wind and sun had bleached the wood to a silver gray, and splinters of it lay scattered on the ground like broken bones. Mara slid down from the horse, her boots landing softly on the salty ground. Her eyes, accustomed now to the gloom, scanned the ruined structure. And then she saw it, scrawled onto the driest, most sheltered part of the main crosspiece was a crude drawing in black charcoal. It was a bird, its wings half spread, its head cocked as if listening to a secret from within the earth. It was a raven, a crow. Asher Crow, Calder said from behind her, his voice low and gravelly. He had seen it too. He was the foreman, a good man, knew this mountain better than he knew the back of his own hand. He was the last one out of the other shafts the day of the collapse. Died trying to warn the men in this one. The charcoal drawing was his mark, a signature left on the threshold of the tomb, A.C. Asher Crow. The ghost now had a name. Mara felt a strange pull toward the entrance, a sense of standing on the edge of a great, unspoken story. She stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over the rubble at the base of the frame. Something was wedged beneath a large, flat stone that had been dislodged from the hillside. It was a dark, rectangular shape, half buried in the dirt. She knelt, her fingers digging into the cold, damp earth. With some effort, she worked the object free. It was a book, a miner's shift ledger, its leather cover swollen and stiff from years of exposure to moisture. The pages were a solid block of mold and decay, smelling of damp and time. Most of it was illegible, a ruin of ink and paper. But as she carefully pried the cover open, she found a few pages in the center that were partially preserved, the writing on them still visible, if faded. They were lists of names, dates, and tonnage reports, but scrawled in the margins, circled, and sometimes written over the official entries, were two frantic letters A.C. They appeared again and again, not as a signature, but as a warning. A desperate signal fire on the page. On the last legible page, next to a tally of timber supports delivered, was a single stark note. The nails are wrong, they will not hold. And beside it, again, the circled initials. He was trying to tell someone, Mara whispered, her fingers tracing the faded ink. He knew. Before Calder could respond, a sound cut through the morning stillness. It was the crunch of heavy boots on the salt path. And then voices, low and menacing. The devil's work finds its way back to the devil's doorstep. 3 men emerged from the gray mist. They were burly, hard-faced men, their expressions a mixture of piety and brute force. Mara recognized them from the mob the night before. They were salt workers, their clothes and skin coated in the same pale dust as the ground they walked on. They worked for the Reverend Pike. The man in the lead, a thick-necked individual with a scarred lip, carried a coil of heavy rope and a tin of kerosene. "The Reverend sent us," the man sneered, his eyes flicking from Calder to Mara. "He says this place is a blight, a festering sore on God's green earth. It needs to be cleansed, purified by fire." He took a step forward, his intentions clear. Burning the mine entrance would not only be a symbolic act of purification, it would be a very practical way of ensuring that whatever secrets were buried here would turn to ash. Calder moved without a word, stepping in front of Mara in a single, fluid motion. He didn't draw his pistol. He didn't need to. He stood there, his body a solid wall of quiet menace, his hands loose at his sides. "Go back to Pike," Calder said, his voice dangerously calm. "Tell him his sermon is over." The lead man chuckled, a humorless, ugly sound. "The Reverend is the shepherd of this flock, Rook, and you're just a lost sheep, bleeding in the wilderness." He and his companions began to spread out, attempting to flank them. The fight was as swift and brutal as it was brief. The man with the kerosene lunged, and Calder met him not with a punch, but with a calculated move. He sidestepped, using the man's own momentum against him, grabbing his arm and twisting. The man yelped as he was spun around and shoved hard into one of his companions. The third man swung a heavy fist at Calder's head. Calder ducked under the blow, his own fist driving upward in a short, sharp jab that landed just under the man's ribs. The air went out of the man in a whoosh, and he staggered back, clutching his side, his face a mask of pained surprise. It was in that moment of violent collision, as the third man stumbled backward against the rotting mine frame, that the mountain finally gave up its secret. The impact, combined with the decayed state of the wood, was too much. A large, load-bearing timber, its core eaten away by rot, splintered with a sharp crack and gave way. It triggered a small slide of dirt and rock from the wall just inside the entrance. Amidst the shower of debris, a dark, cloth-wrapped bundle tumbled out, landing with a solid, heavy thud on the ground. Everyone froze. The three workers stared at the object, their aggression forgotten, replaced by a sudden, superstitious dread. Calder and Mara stared at it with a dawning, heart-pounding certainty. The bundle was made of oilcloth, now rotted and falling apart, wrapped around what looked like a small wooden box. As Mara watched, a chunk of the decayed wood crumbled away, revealing the dark, rusted iron of a small safe. It had been hidden inside the wall of the mine entrance. "Go deeper, make it quick inside." Mara's grandmother's words echoed in her mind, no longer a riddle, but a literal instruction. The safe was the destination. The three men, unnerved by this unexpected turn of events, exchanged fearful glances. This was more than they had bargained for. Without another word, they turned and retreated down the path. Their mission of purification abandoned in the face of this tangible, unsettling discovery. Calder knelt beside the safe. It was old, its surface pitted and scaled with rust. The lock was a simple, circular mechanism, but the keyhole was not a standard shape. It was a narrow, crescent-shaped slit with a small, circular depression at its center. There was no key. Mara looked down at the silver pendant in her hand, which she had unwrapped from her wrist before they started their search. She looked at the strange lock, and then back at the pendant, the shape of a cottonwood seed, a crescent with a round base. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She moved forward, kneeling in the dust beside Calder. Her hand was trembling as she held the silver pendant up to the lock. It was a perfect match. She slid the rounded end into the circular depression and pushed the curved edge into the crescent slit. It fit. With a soft click, it seated itself perfectly inside the mechanism. She looked at Calder. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his eyes were fixed on the safe with a burning intensity. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the pendant and twisted. For a moment, there was resistance. Then, with a dry, grating crack that echoed in the morning silence, the rusted tumblers inside the lock gave way. A solid thunk signaled that the bolt had been thrown. The curse had been broken, not by prayer or fire, but by a simple, mechanical act. Calder reached out and lifted the small, heavy lid. The air that escaped from within smelled of old paper and dried ink. The contents were wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, which had kept them remarkably preserved. There were 3 items. The first was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the tight, controlled script of a meticulous man. The second was a roll of thick vellum sheets. Calder carefully unrolled them, revealing detailed, hand-drawn blueprint schematics for the mine's timber support network, with notes and calculations in the margins. The third was a folded document, an official-looking contract with the letterhead of a large insurance company from back east. It remained unsigned. Mara picked up the journal, opening it to the last entry. The handwriting here was different. It was rushed, frantic, the letters sharp and slanted. It was dated the day of the collapse. Her eyes scanned the page, and she began to read the final words of Asher Crow aloud, her voice clear and steady in the quiet of the morning. "There is no curse," she read. "There are faulty nails and a greed that demands a higher yield. Pike cut the timber budget. He swapped the galvanized steel for cheap iron. They will not hold. I am locking this away. The chew." The sentence was unfinished, cut off as if the writer had been interrupted. But the truth of it was as stark and damning as the drawing on the wall. Calder stared at the blueprints in his hand, then at the journal in hers. The whole world seemed to shift on its axis. The story he had built his life around for 5 years, the grand, terrible myth of a cursed mountain, crumbled into dust. It was replaced by a small, ugly, and profoundly human truth. His wife and son hadn't been taken by a vengeful spirit of the earth. They had been killed by cheap nails. The silence that followed the opening of the safe was heavier than the mountain itself. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of spoken words and the weight of things left unsaid for years. Calder and Mara knelt in the dust, the three artifacts of a buried truth laid out between them on the crumbling oilcloth: a journal, a set of rolled blueprints, and a folded contract. The gray morning light seemed to converge on these objects, as if the sun itself had held its breath. Calder reached for the blueprints first. He was a man of the earth, of angles and stresses, of things that were either true or they failed. His calloused fingers, surprisingly deft, unrolled the stiff vellum. The drawings were precise, an intricate lattice of timber supports, crossbeams, and retaining walls. In the margins were Asher Crow's neat calculations, notes on load-bearing capacity, and specifications for the hardware that was meant to hold the world up. He ran a thumb over a notation specifying 3/4-inch galvanized steel nails. Then he picked up the shift ledger they had found earlier, his other hand still resting on the blueprints. He flipped to the page Mara had found, the last legible one. His eyes found the frantic scrawl: "The nails are wrong. They will not hold." He looked from the blueprint's specification to the foreman's desperate warning. The two pieces of paper, one an instruction and the other a cry of alarm, told a story of deliberate betrayal. It wasn't a curse that had brought the mountain down. It was a choice. Someone had chosen to save money on nails. The realization settled in not with a flash of anger, but with a cold, heavy dread. It was the kind of banal, grubby evil that was somehow worse than any supernatural curse. A curse was an act of a vengeful god. This was the act of a cheap man. While Calder was lost in the grim mathematics of the collapse, Mara picked up the journal. It was small, bound in dark leather, and felt strangely warm to the touch. She opened it, and the pages were filled with Asher Crow's steady, even script. It was mostly a record of his work: geological observations, progress reports, payroll notes. But woven between the technical details was the story of a man. He wrote of the way the morning light hit the high peaks, of a hawk he'd seen nesting on a ledge, of his hope to one day send for his daughter, a girl he had been separated from by hardship and distance. Calder finally put down the ledger and took the journal from her, his gaze drawn to the final, frantic entry. He read it aloud this time, his voice a low, rough monotone, as if he needed to hear the words in the air to believe them. "There is no curse. There are faulty nails and a greed that demands a higher yield. Pike cut the timber budget. He swapped the galvanized steel for cheap iron. They will not hold. I am locking this away. The shift change bell." He paused, his throat working. He traced the last, nearly illegible word with his finger. "Sabotaged. I tried to warn them, but the bell wouldn't ring. I have to go back. God help us." The journal entry ended there. The story it told was sickeningly clear. Asher Crow, realizing the mine was a death trap, had taken the time to secure the proof. He had then run to ring the warning bell, the signal for immediate evacuation, only to find it had been deliberately disabled. He had died trying to save the men inside, including Calder's family, from a disaster that had been set in motion by a man in an office. The name Pike hung in the air between them, not just a name, a dynasty of piety and influence in Dustfall Flats. Mara felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine. The pendant, her grandmother's key, was not just a key to a safe. It was a legacy. Asher Crow, a man of integrity, had tried to send the proof of the crime to the one person he trusted: his lost daughter, Mara's grandmother. He had died trying to get this story out, and the story had traveled through a generation, waiting for someone to finally carry it across the finish line. As Calder stared at the last page of the journal, his face a mask of cold fury, Mara noticed something else. Tucked inside the insurance contract was another, smaller document. A single sheet, a work order directive. It was an official instruction to increase the daily tonnage quota from the No. 3 shaft by 20%. It demanded faster work, more output, and authorized the use of alternate, cost-saving materials to meet the new schedule. It was a death warrant, written on company letterhead. At the bottom, above the title of mine owner, was a signature. It was not the hurried scrawl of a foreman. It was an elegant, confident signature, written with a flourish of authority. Ezra Pike. The name was a thunderclap in the silence. Ezra Pike, the father of the Reverend Pike, the man who had built the church, who had owned the salt works, who had been the patriarch of the town until his death a decade ago. He was the one who had first spoken of the land being cursed after a minor rockslide years before the main collapse, planting the seed of the story that had grown to choke the town. It all clicked into place, a series of ugly, rusted gears grinding together. Ezra Pike and the town council, hungry for profit, pushed the miners past the limits of safety. They cut corners, used cheap materials, and ignored the warnings of their own foreman. When the inevitable happened, when the mountain shrugged and buried their greed, they didn't confess. They resurrected the old story. They built a mythology of a curse, a convenient, faceless villain to blame. It was easier to fear the earth than to confront the greed of your neighbor. The Reverend Pike wasn't just a pious man protecting his flock from superstition. He was a son protecting his father's murderous legacy. A tremor went through Mara's body, a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold. The name Pike unlocked her own memories, her grandmother's final days, the fear that had lingered in her eyes. "My grandmother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She tried to come back here, years ago, after she got the news about the collapse and received the package with the key. She told me she was met on the road, miles from town. She didn't say by who, only that they told her if she or the crow key were ever seen in this valley again, the truth wouldn't be the only thing that got buried." She looked at Calder, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. She was threatened into silence. She spent the rest of her life afraid. Calder slowly closed the journal. He placed it carefully on top of the blueprints. He looked up, not at Mara, but at the gaping, dark maw of the mine. He looked at the mountain, at the silent, gray rock that towered above them. His face, which had been a storm of anger and grief, slowly settled into a profound, terrifying calm. The curtain had finally been pulled back. The ghost that had haunted him for 5 years was not the spirit of the mountain. It was the face of Ezra Pike. He saw his son, Samuel, not as a silhouette being swallowed by the earth, but as he was that last morning, his face bright, his pockets full of rocks, his laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. The curse had been a shroud thrown over that memory, making it monstrous and unknowable. Now, the shroud was gone. He could see his boy's face again, and he could see the faces of the men who had killed him. He pushed himself to his feet, turning his back on the mine to face the valley below. He drew a long, slow breath, the air clean and cold in his lungs. "I blamed the earth," he whispered, the words spoken to himself, to the ghosts of his wife and son. "For 5 years, I've hated this rock, this dirt. I thought it had a will. I thought it had a hunger. But the earth just stands still." It was a confession, an absolution. The hatred that had been his constant companion, the bitter grief that had been his only fuel, shifted, untethered from the land and sought a new, true target. Ooh. A sharp whistle cut through the air from down the path. It was followed by a man's shout. "They're up here, get the torches." Calder and Mara turned. Emerging from the morning mist were not 3, but a dozen of Pike's men, and this time they were not coming to talk. They carried torches, the flames leaving trails of greasy black smoke in the gray air. The Reverend Pike himself was with them, his face a mask of cold fury, a Bible in one hand and a burning brand in the other. They had come to burn the evidence, to burn the truth. The smoke from their torches, thick with the smell of kerosene, began to drift toward the mine entrance. It coiled and snaked its way over the rubble, a foul, black tongue tasting the air, seeking to suffocate the story before it could be told. There was no time to think. Calder moved with the swift, decisive grace of a predator. He scooped up the journal, the blueprints, and the contract, the entire history of the crime. He turned to Mara, his eyes locking with hers. He didn't have to explain. She saw the plan, the only plan, form in his gaze. He shoved the bundle of documents inside her heavy wool coat. "There's an air vent," he said, his voice low and urgent, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Shaft number 2, 100 yards west of here. It's a straight run down the old mule track. Run. Don't stop for anything." He was pushing her away from the entrance, toward the cover of the rocks. "I'll hold them here." He was giving her the truth and a chance to escape with it. He was preparing to stand between her and the fire, to buy her time with his own body. But Mara didn't run. She planted her feet, resisting his push. She looked from the evidence bundled under her coat to the determined set of his jaw, and then to the approaching flames. She had been a messenger her whole life, carrying a story she didn't understand. Now she understood, and she would not abandon the last man standing guard over it. "No," she said, her voice quiet but as unyielding as the mountain beside them. "I'm staying." Their wills locked, two pieces of steel forged in the same fire. In that moment, they were no longer a rancher and a stranger. They were the last two witnesses, and they would face the fire together. Night fell on Dustfall Flats, not as a comfort, but as a shroud. In the center of the town square, directly in front of the tall, austere facade of the church his father had built, Reverend Pike was constructing a stage for his final act. It was not a gallows, but a pyre. Piles of dry timber and brushwood were stacked high around a central post, the same blackened post they had dragged from the dead wheat field. Pike moved with a feverish energy, directing his men, his voice ringing out across the square with pronouncements of purification and the casting out of demons. He was orchestrating a spectacle, a grand ritual to burn away the town's resurgent fear and, with it, the inconvenient questions that had begun to surface. The people of the town gathered, drawn by a magnetic mixture of dread and duty. They stood in huddled groups, their faces lit by the flickering, greasy light of torches. They had followed the Reverend's lead for years, his words a balm on their collective wound. Now, he was offering them a final, fiery catharsis. He promised them that with the dawn, the curse would be cleansed forever. What he meant was that with the dawn, the truth would be reduced to ash. Into this charged and volatile theater rode Calder and Mara. They came not from the dark trails of the hills, but straight down the main thoroughfare, their horses' hooves a slow, deliberate drumbeat against the packed earth. They did not shout or brandish weapons. Their arrival was a quiet statement of intent, an interruption of the ceremony simply by their presence. They halted at the edge of the assembled crowd, just beyond the ring of torchlight. All eyes turned to them. The murmuring died, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Reverend Pike, standing on the steps of his church, turned slowly. When he saw them, a thin, cold smile touched his lips. It was a smile of supreme confidence, of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Brother Rook," he called out, his voice smooth and sonorous, carrying easily in the still night air. "And the woman Quinn, have you come to confess your sins, to repent before this holy cleansing?" Mara swung her leg over the saddle and slid to the ground before Calder could stop her. She walked forward, not with the tentative steps of the accused, but with the steady, measured stride of a prosecutor entering a courtroom. The crowd parted for her, a human sea receding before a grim purpose. She walked until she reached the bottom step of the church, the unfinished pyre looming to her left. The documents, the journal, the blueprints, the contracts were held tightly in her hands. She did not speak. She simply tossed the bundle onto the steps at Pike's feet. The rolled blueprints came undone, spreading across the dusty wood like an unfurled accusation. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not loud, but it was as cold and sharp as newly broken ice. "Are you trying to burn a curse, Reverend, or are you trying to burn the evidence?" A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The question was a direct challenge, a blasphemy against the entire narrative he had so carefully constructed. Pike's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, wider and more brittle than before. He laughed, a hollow sound that held no mirth. He nudged the blueprints with the toe of his polished boot, a gesture of profound contempt. Evidence, he scoffed, his gaze sweeping over his flock. Since when has paper had a voice? Since when have the scribbles of a dead man held more weight than the word of God? Spoken through his humble servant, he spread his hands wide, a gesture of paternal benevolence. These are lies, my friends, tricks of the devil, brought here by this woman to sow dissent and fear among us. We will burn them, and we will burn the evil that brought them here. A few voices in the crowd shouted amen, but they were hesitant, weaker than they would have been an hour before. The sight of the physical documents had planted a seed of doubt. Before Pike could continue, a gunshot exploded through the square. The sound was flat and final. Every head whipped around to see Calder, still mounted on his horse, his pistol held steady in his hand, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. He had not fired at Pike. He had not fired at the sky. The bullet had struck the hand-painted sign nailed to the church door. It was a neat, round hole, punched directly through the words of the fourth commandment on the sign that read, "Thou shalt not blaspheme." The irony was lost on no one. It was a shot that spoke louder than any sermon. It was a declaration that the real blasphemy was happening right here, on these steps. Pike's face went white with fury. "You dare defile the house of the Lord, Rook." "The house is fine," Calder said, his voice a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "It's the lies told on its steps I have a problem with." Mara seized the moment of stunned silence. She bent down and picked up the work order, the single sheet of paper that carried the weight of so many lives. She held it up, her hand steady in the torchlight. "Paper may not have a voice," she called out, her words ringing with a newfound strength, "but it does have a name." She read the words from the bottom of the page, her voice gaining volume and clarity with each syllable. "By order of the Dustfall Mining Company, to increase daily yield by 20%, effective immediately." And it is signed, at the bottom, by the mine owner. She paused, letting the silence stretch, drawing every eye to her. Ezra Pike. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like the wind being knocked out of the town's lungs. Ezra Pike was not a villain. He was a founder, a patriarch, a name etched onto the plaque in the town hall. To implicate him was to attack the very foundation of Dustfall Flats. The people looked at each other, their faith in the Reverend warring with the undeniable evidence of his father's name on a damning document. Their certainty began to fracture. From the edge of the crowd, a woman's voice, thin and trembling, cut through the new, uneasy silence. Then, what about the children? It was Elspeth Miller, the granary keeper, the woman who had first screamed that Mara was an omen. Her face was a mess of confusion and dawning horror. Her own son had been a shifter in the No. 3 shaft. She had spent 5 years believing he had been taken by a curse. She looked at Calder, her eyes pleading. "The boys who died in that mine, my son." Calder's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at her. He saw not an accuser, but another victim of the same lie that had consumed him. He swung down from his horse, landing with a soft thud on the ground. "They didn't die because of a curse." "Elspeth," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the square. He walked forward until he stood beside Mara, a united front of quiet, unshakable truth. "They died because of cheap screws, and they died because fear was given a stage." The simple, brutal honesty of his words was devastating. He had given them a new story, a true one, and it was 1,000 times more terrible than the myth of the curse. A curse was fate. Cheap screws were murder. Reverend Pike saw his control shattering. The faces that looked at him were no longer filled with adoration, but with suspicion and a growing, terrible anger. His piety was useless against this kind of truth. He fell back on his last, most reliable tool. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the scarred man who had led the party at the mine. It was a signal. The time for words was over. The man and 2 others began to move, their hands reaching for the heavy clubs tucked in their belts. The crowd instinctively fell back, clearing a space around them. The confrontation was about to turn into a brawl, but Mara had one card left to play. She didn't flinch or retreat. She simply took one step back, placing a calming hand on the neck of Calder's horse. She raised her voice, not in a shout, but in a clear, carrying tone that was a direct challenge to the Reverend. "Go deeper," she called out, the words of her grandmother's letter now a weapon. "If you want the whole truth, don't look in the mine. Dig into the church's ledgers." Pike froze, the color draining from his face. The challenge was specific, a surgical strike at the heart of his power. It implied a different kind of crime, a more personal one. Before he could answer, a new voice spoke from the crowd. It was a young man, thin and bookish, with ink stains on his fingers. It was Thomas Gable, the clerk from the post office and telegraph station, a boy who rarely spoke above a whisper. He stepped forward, holding a piece of paper in his trembling hand. "He's right," Thomas said, his voice shaky but determined. "The church ledgers, and the bank transfers." All eyes turned to him. The insurance policy on the mine, the one Asher Crow never signed. It was a corporate policy, but after the collapse, a new claim was filed, a private one. He took a deep breath, his courage growing as he spoke. The payout wasn't made to the town, or to the families of the men who died. It was paid directly into a private account. He held up the telegraph flimsy. A bank transfer statement from the regional office in Sacramento, an account belonging to the Church of Dustfall Flats, an account controlled by one man. He looked directly at Reverend Pike. The mask did not just fall, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the flickering torchlight, the townspeople saw their shepherd not as a man of God, but as the son of a killer and a thief who had built his church on a foundation of lies and blood money. The trial was over. The exposure of the truth did not bring quiet resolution, it brought combustion. For a moment, the town square was frozen in a state of collective shock, the torchlight illuminating 100 faces caught between a lifetime of faith and a minute of shattering revelation. Reverend Pike, stripped of his righteous mantle, was left with only the raw, sputtering fury of a cornered animal. The mask was gone, and the face beneath was ugly. His voice, when he finally broke the silence, was no longer the smooth, reassuring baritone of a shepherd. It was a raw, ragged shriek of command. Blasphemy lies seize them, cleanse this place of their poison. His remaining loyalists, the men who were bound to him not by faith but by coin and complicity, needed no further encouragement. With a collective roar, they moved. One of them, the scarred man from the mine, hurled his torch. It spun end over end, a comet of fire arcing through the night air, aimed directly at the pyre, at the papers still scattered on the church steps. He intended to start the fire the town no longer wanted. Calder moved with an economy of motion that was terrifying to behold. He didn't have a gun in his hand now. He had something more primal. He seized a long, heavy piece of timber that had been intended for the pyre, hefting it like a quarterstaff. He met the torch in mid-air, not blocking it, but sweeping it aside with a powerful, fluid strike. The flaming brand was sent tumbling into the empty, dusty space in the center of the square, where it sputtered and died harmlessly. A second torch was thrown, this one aimed lower, at Mara. Calder pivoted, the heavy timber whistling through the air. He connected with the second torch, sending it skittering away. But the sudden, violent motion put too much strain on his left leg, the one that had been crushed by a spooked horse years ago. A sharp, searing pain shot up from his knee, and his leg buckled. He grunted, stumbling to one knee, the injury a ghost from his past choosing this exact moment to remind him of his own mortality. Seeing him falter, Pike's men surged forward, but in that same instant, Mara acted. She wasn't a fighter, but she saw the new, more dangerous fire that was about to erupt. While all eyes were on the men, she darted to the side of the church, to the thick, weathered rope that hung beside the main doors. The fire bell. It hadn't been rung in earnest since the night the old livery stable burned down. Years before the mine collapse, it was a sound reserved for a specific kind of communal terror. She threw her entire weight onto the rope. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning screech of rusted metal, the great iron bell in the steeple above began to move. A single, discordant clang echoed across the square. She pulled again and again, establishing a rhythm. clang, clang, clang. The sound was a shock to the system of the town. It was a deep, resonant, and deeply alarming peal that sliced through the night. It was not the sound of righteous fury. It was the sound of imminent disaster. It was a call not to a pyre, but to the water pump. It was a sound that pulled people from their homes, that united them against a common enemy of flame and chaos. The sound itself seemed to suck the air out of Pike's manufactured ceremony, reminding the townspeople that their real duty was to each other, not to one man's crusade. It drew their focus away from the fire Pike wanted and toward the community he was trying to tear apart. The ringing of the bell broke the spell completely. The ensuing fight was not a grand battle. It was a short, dirty, desperate scuffle in the dust and flickering torchlight. Calder, using the heavy timber as both a weapon and a crutch, rose to meet the first of Pike's men. He didn't swing to kill, but to disable. A hard thrust to the gut, a sweeping blow to the legs. The townspeople, jolted into action by the bell, did not simply watch. Men who had been part of Pike's flock moments before now surged forward to help Calder, not with weapons, but with their bodies, forming a human wall. It was a clumsy, shoving, grunting affair. Fists flew. A man went down with a bloody nose. Another clutched a bruised jaw. It was the messy, inglorious work of a community taking out its own trash. Reverend Pike watched his authority crumble into a street brawl. His power, which had been absolute, was gone. He was no longer a prophet. He was just a man who had been caught. In his eyes, a desperate, wild light appeared. If he could not control them with faith, he would control them with fear. His hand disappeared into the folds of his long black coat. When it reappeared, it held a small, silver-plated derringer, a preacher's gun, a hypocrite's last resort. He raised the pistol, his arm steady. The brawl was a chaotic mess, and no one saw him but Mara. He wasn't aiming at the men fighting his loyalists. He was aiming at the source of his ruin. He was aiming at Calder Rook. There was no time to shout a warning, no time to do anything but react. Mara's hand went instinctively to the leather cord at her neck. She ripped the silver pendant free. It was cool and heavy in her palm, the key that had unlocked the safe, the truth. And now, this final, terrible moment, with emotion born of pure, unthinking desperation, she threw it. She didn't aim, she just threw. The silver seed spun through the air, a glinting, unlikely projectile. It struck Reverend Pike's wrist with a sharp crack just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The gun fired, but the impact of the pendant had thrown his aim wildly off. The shot, meant for Calder's back, went wide, streaking past his head. The lead ball struck the stone statue of a saint that stood in a small niche beside the church doors. There was a sharp crack of stone on stone, and a large chip flew from the saint's serene, beatific face, leaving a white, ugly scar. The gunshot, followed by the desecration of the holy statue, brought the entire town to a dead, absolute halt. The brawl ceased. The shouting stopped. Every single person in the square, including Calder and Pike's men, froze and stared. They stared at the wounded saint, its placid expression now marred by a mark of violence. They stared at the derringer in the reverend's hand, and they stared at the man of God who had just attempted to commit murder in the shadow of his own church. The silence was profound. In that silence, the silver pendant, having done its work, lay in the dust at Pike's feet. Then, a single figure moved. It was Elspeth Miller, the thin, frail granary keeper. The woman whose shriek had started Mara's ordeal walked slowly and deliberately out of the crowd. She did not look at Mara. She did not look at Calder. She walked directly toward Reverend Pike, her face a mask of grief and disillusionment. She stopped directly in front of him, placing her own brittle body between the preacher's gun and Mara. She looked up into the face of the man she had followed for years, the man who had given her a curse to blame for her son's death, and her voice, when she spoke, was not a shriek. It was as quiet and final as the closing of a tomb. "Enough," she said. That one word from that one woman was the final verdict. It was the judgment of the town. As if on a silent signal, the crowd turned, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate wave, one by one, family by family. They turned their backs on the Reverend Pike, on his pyre, on his church. It was not a violent act, but it was the most profound rejection imaginable. They were leaving him alone with his sins. Their power, which he had borrowed for so long, was being reclaimed. They were no longer his flock. They were just people, facing each other once more. The rest was a formality. Someone had already ridden for the county sheriff in the next town over. When he arrived an hour later, there was no resistance. The journal, the blueprints, and the contract were laid out on the sheriff's desk, a chain of paper and ink that was stronger than any iron shackles. As they led him away, his hands bound, Reverend Pike finally broke. His composure, his piety, his authority, it all fell away, leaving only a raving, pathetic man. He thrashed against his captors, his eyes wild. "It's the curse," he screamed, his voice hoarse. "The curse of the land. She brought it back. It's in the ground, in the rock. It will take you all." He was still screaming as they loaded him into the wagon, but no one was listening anymore. Mara stood in the center of the square, watching him go. She stooped and picked up a single rusted nail from the box of evidence Calder had brought back from the mine. She held it up for the remaining townspeople to see. "He's right," she said, her voice carrying in the now quiet square. "There is a curse." She turned the nail over in her fingers, showing them the small, helical ridges of the screw. "The curse has threads." A gust of wind swept through the square, picking up the dust and the loose ash from the scattered torches. It swirled around the unlit pyre, a cleansing breath of cool night air that carried away the stench of kerosene and deceit. It was a different kind of purification. Calder stood a few feet away, his weight resting on his good leg. He watched Mara as she stood there, her face calm in the moonlight, the nail held loosely in her hand. For 5 years, his world, his heart, his very soul had been a house with the windows and doors boarded up, left to rot in the darkness of his own grief. He had thought that was his life now. He had thought there was nothing else. But watching her, seeing the quiet strength that had faced down a mob, a liar, and a bullet, he felt something shift inside him. It was a faint, unfamiliar feeling, like the first hint of a breeze through a sealed room. He looked at Mara, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt as if he were looking at an open window in that dark, boarded-up house, a window that let in the clean, cold, and terrifying light of a new day. The return to the Rook Ranch was a silent pilgrimage under a sky beginning to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple. The fury of the night had spent itself, leaving behind a profound and echoing quiet. Inside the barn, the air was cool and smelled of hay, horse, and the sharp, clean scent of freshly cut pine. A new support beam, a massive length of timber Calder had been seasoning for months, lay across 2 sawhorses, its pale, raw grain luminous in the single lantern he carried. He had intended it for the upper loft, a repair long overdue. Now, it had a new purpose. He set the lantern down, the light casting long, dancing shadows. From his workshop, he retrieved a mallet and a set of carving gouges, their steel edges honed to a razor's sharpness. He ran his hand over the smooth, planed surface of the beam, feeling the life still in the wood. Mara stood in the wide doorway, the wool blanket still draped over her shoulders. She didn't speak. She watched as he chose a gouge and placed its tip against the wood. He was not just a rancher, he was a craftsman. The first cut was sure and deep, the wood curling away in a perfect, fragrant spiral. He worked with a focused, consuming intensity, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the mallet the only sound in the cavernous space. He was not carving words. He was excavating a memory. First, the sharp, clean lines of an A, then another, R-O-N. Each letter was a prayer, a statement, a reclamation. For 5 years, the name of his son had been a ghost in his own mind, a whisper tied to the monstrous, shapeless idea of a curse. He had allowed the town's fear to define his loss, to steal the very name of his child and wrap it in superstition. The boy in his memory had become a victim of the mountain, a sacrifice to a dark legend. Now, with each tap of the mallet, he was carving away the lie. This name did not belong to the darkness. It did not belong to the mine or the myth. He finished the first name and moved on. R-O-O-K, his own name, the legacy, the name the boy should have carried into manhood. He worked until the full name was deeply incised into the wood, the letters stark and beautiful against the pale grain. Aaron Rook. He stepped back, his chest heaving, the tools hanging loosely in his hands. He read the name, his lips moving silently. It was a name, clean and whole. He looked over at Mara, and his voice was rough, thick with an emotion he had suppressed for half a decade. "Not the devil's," he said, the words a raw testament. "Mine." Mara walked forward, her boots silent on the straw-strewn floor. She stopped before the beam and looked at the name, at the love and grief carved into the wood. She did not offer words of comfort. She knew that words were useless for this kind of pain. Instead, she reached out and laid her hand gently on the newly carved letters, her palm resting flat against the wood. Her fingers traced the deep grooves of the A, the curve of the R. Her eyes closed. It was a silent, wordless prayer, a prayer for Aaron Rook, a boy she had never known, a prayer for his mother, Ilara, a prayer for Asher Crow, the honest foreman who had tried to stop the tragedy, and a prayer for her own grandmother, a woman who had lived a life of fear, haunted by a key she couldn't use and a truth she couldn't speak. She felt the faint vibration of the living wood under her hand and prayed for all the lives that had been buried under the weight of the earth, and under the heavier weight of a lie. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Calder. His face, in the lantern light, was a study in exhaustion and release. The hard, iron mask of grief he had worn for so long had finally cracked. They went back to the kitchen. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light through the small room. The silver pendant lay on the oak table where Mara had left it, looking like a single, solidified tear in the dim light. They sat on either side of it, the silence between them no longer tense, but companionable, a shared quiet. The pendant had been a key, a catalyst, an heirloom of a terrible secret. Now, its purpose was fulfilled. It was just a piece of metal, heavy with history. "Should we melt it down?" Mara asked, her voice soft. "Let the fire have it end the story." Calder looked at the pendant, at the way the firelight licked at its tarnished surface as if tasting a long, bitter tale. He thought of Asher Crow, a good man, trying to send a warning to his daughter. He thought of Mara's grandmother, treasuring this object, this last link to a father she barely knew, even as she feared it. He thought of Mara herself, carrying it back here, an act of faith that had nearly cost her her life. To destroy it felt wrong. It was not an ending the story deserved. "No," Calder said, his voice firm. He met her gaze across the table. "We return it." They rode out again as the first true light of dawn began to touch the high peaks. They didn't take the salt path this time, but a higher trail that gave them a view of the entire valley. The world below was still cloaked in shadow, peaceful, as if the violence of the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. They dismounted at the entrance to the No. 3 shaft. The air was cold, smelling of stone and damp earth. The place no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a crime scene, the evidence now brought into the light. Calder used the sharp point of a rock to dig a small, deep hole in the earth, right where the rusted safe had been hidden for so many years, inside the ruined wall. He took the silver pendant from his pocket. He held it for a moment in his palm, feeling its weight. He had come here so many times over the years, standing before this collapsed entrance, filled with a helpless, directionless rage at the mountain, at the world. Now, he felt only a vast, aching sadness, and a sliver of something that might one day become peace. He placed the pendant gently into the hole, the leather cord coiling around it. He filled the hole with dirt, packing it down firmly. The key was now back in the earth, its long journey over, but the grave felt incomplete. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an object he had brought from his workshop. It was a single, heavy nail, a full 3/4 of an inch thick. It was brand new, its galvanized steel head shining a dull, honest silver in the morning light. It was the right nail, the kind of nail that holds, the kind that doesn't betray the men who trust their lives to it. He pushed the nail deep into the soft earth of the filled hole, until only its flat, wide head was visible. It was a marker, a promise, a small, shining monument to a truth that had been too long buried. They stood there for a long time, looking at the small, humble marker. The wind sighed through the pines on the ridge above them, a sound like a long, slow exhalation. Calder finally broke the silence. He was not looking at Mara, but at the ground, at the final resting place of the lie. His confession, when it came, was quiet, stripped of all artifice, a piece of his own raw truth laid bare. "I had come to love my grief more than the truth," he admitted, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. The grief was simple. It was big. It explained everything. It meant I didn't have to do anything but hate. The truth is small. It's about a man signing a piece of paper. It's about a box of cheap nails. It's messier. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear and filled with a profound, weary clarity. "It's harder." Mara offered him a small, tired smile. She understood. The lie was a fortress. The truth was an open field, and you had to learn to walk in it all over again. "The truth is a hard thing to love," she agreed, her voice gentle, "but it doesn't leave you." In that moment, something inside Calder's chest shifted. For 5 years, he had carried a hollow space inside him, a void where his heart had been. It was a place of immense pressure, a vacuum that sucked all the light and air out of his life. But now, listening to her words, standing under the wide-open sky, he felt a change. The pressure eased. It felt as if that hollow space, that wound, could suddenly, for the first time, draw a breath. It was a sharp, painful, and unbelievably welcome sensation. It was the feeling of a lung inflating after being collapsed for a very long time. He looked at Mara, at her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, at the way the morning light caught the stray strands of hair around her face. She had not just brought him the truth. She had brought him air. She had brought him back to the world of the living. He reached out, his hand moving slowly and gently touched the back of her hand where it rested on the saddle of her horse. It was not a gesture of romance or of possession. It was simpler and far more profound than that. It was the touch of a survivor, a quiet, humble acknowledgement of a shared ordeal, a thank you that no words could ever properly convey. His calloused, scarred fingers rested for a moment against her skin, which was still chafed and red from the ropes. It was a contact between two people who had been wounded by the same story, and who had, together, found a way to write a new ending. She did not pull away. She simply let his hand rest there, a small point of warmth in the cool morning air. From far down the valley, a low, deep rumble echoed through the hills. It was not the sound of the mine, or of men. It was the sound of the sky. They both looked up. To the west, the horizon was darkening, the clouds gathering in a thick, gray bank. The first rains of the season were coming. A storm was on its way to wash the salt and the dust from the valley floor. The rain began not as a storm, but as a sigh. It was a slow, deliberate release of a tension that had been building in the sky for days. The first drops struck the pale, salt-crusted earth of Dustfall Flats not with violence, but with a soft, percussive tapping, like fingertips on a drumskin. They left dark, spreading circles in the white dust, as if the ground itself were bleeding. Then more came, and more, until the tapping became a steady, whispering hiss, a sound the valley had not heard in a very long time. It was a cleansing. The rain, soft and persistent, fell upon the dead wheat field where Mara had been bound. It landed on the blackened post and traced clean, dark lines down its charred length. It found the circle of salt, the crude, superstitious barrier meant to contain an evil that had never existed. At first, the water beaded on the crystalline surface, but soon it began to seep in, turning the stark white line into a murky, gray brine. The water gathered, pooled, and then began to move, a tiny, determined rivulet that cut a path through the salt, dissolving the barrier, erasing the line between the sacred and the profane. The salt, which had been a symbol of the town's barren grief and bitter fear, was simply washed away, carried back into the thirsty soil from which it had been taken. And with the washing of the earth came a new sound. It started in one of the small houses bordering the square, then another, and another. It was the sound of laughter. Children, who for years had played in hushed, watchful groups, their games shadowed by the whispers of a curse, were suddenly released. They burst from their homes, their bare feet slapping against the wet earth, their faces turned up to the sky. They ran through the newly formed puddles, splashing and shouting, their laughter a bright, clean sound, utterly devoid of fear. They were not afraid of the mountain, or the mine, or the ghosts their parents had taught them to dread. It was just rain, a gift from the sky, and they greeted it with the pure, uncomplicated joy of the innocent. The next day, under a sky washed clean and a sun that seemed to shine with a new, gentler light, the outside world arrived. 2 men from the county seat, their city clothes looking stiff and out of place, rode in with the sheriff. They represented the Office of Territorial Mines. They spoke in the clipped, formal language of bureaucracy and law, a language that had no room for curses or omens. They drove stakes into the ground around the entrance to the No. 3 shaft, stringing a thick rope between them. A quarantine. They nailed a notice to a newly erected post, its black ink a stark and final verdict on the old story. The notice spoke of structural instability, of an official inquiry, and of a reclamation and safety plan to be issued. The mountain was no longer a malevolent entity. It was a geological problem to be solved with engineering and expertise. The town's fear was being replaced by a blueprint. Later that afternoon, a solitary figure walked the muddy track to the Rook Ranch. It was Elspeth Miller. She was not the shrieking harpy of the mob, nor the broken woman of the town square. She was just an old woman, her face etched with a grief that was now true and correctly placed. She carried something wrapped in a clean linen cloth. She did not knock. She stood on the porch until Mara came to the door. Elspeth did not meet her eyes. She looked down at the offering in her hands, her knuckles white. She held it out. It was a loaf of bread, still warm from her oven, the crust a deep golden brown. It was the humblest and most profound of offerings. My boy is gone," Elspeth stammered, her voice thick. "For 5 years. I blamed a story. It was easier. It meant I had someone to hate." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. The truth just means he's gone, and I helped make it worse for everyone." She pushed the bread toward Mara. "I am sorry." It was an apology made of flour and yeast and heat, an apology for the salt circle, for the cries for fire, for a lifetime of fear that had curdled into hate. Mara took the loaf, its warmth spread through her hands. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The acceptance was enough. Elspeth turned and walked away, her shoulders a little less stooped, as if a great weight had been lifted. The work of reclamation began, not just in the mines, but in the town. Calder stood with the young engineer from the county, a man with clear eyes and hands that were clean but competent. He had unrolled Asher Crow's original blueprints on the hood of a wagon, weighting the corners with rocks. "It's a good design," the young man said, his finger tracing the intricate support lattice. "Solid, honest. If they had built it to this standard—" He shook his head, leaving the rest unsaid. Calder looked at the blueprints, the last will and testament of an honest man. He had thought to frame them, to keep them as a reminder, but he saw now that their purpose was not to be a relic of the past, but a guide for the future. He folded them carefully and handed them to the engineer. "Here," Calder said. "The mountain didn't kill those men. A bad story did." He tapped the folded blueprints. "Let good work win out over a bad story." The young engineer took the plans, his expression one of solemn respect. He understood that he was being given more than just a set of drawings. He was being handed a trust. That evening, as the rain began to fall again, a soft, steady drumming on the roof, Mara sat at the kitchen table. She had a pen and a single sheet of paper. She was writing to her mother, a letter that felt like the closing of a circle that had stretched across a continent and a generation. "I have done what grandmother asked," she wrote, the ink flowing smoothly from the nib. "The key has been returned. I came here looking for my roots, and I found them. Not in a name on a family tree, but in a truth that was buried in the ground. The people here are learning to live with the truth. It is a harder life, in some ways, but it is their own. Do not worry for me. I have found, not what I was looking for, but what I needed to find." The stagecoach that had brought the officials from the county seat did not return empty. Reverend Pike was taken away in chains, his face pressed against the bars of the small window in the back of the coach. He was still preaching, his voice a hoarse, desperate rant against the rain that was splattering against the glass. He shouted of damnation and the devil's work, of a curse that would not be denied. But his congregation was gone. His words were lost to the wind and the rain, the last rantings of the last fish in a poisoned and rapidly draining pond. That night, the rain fell in earnest, a solid silver sheet of water that washed the world clean. Mara lay on the small cot by the hearth, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic drumming on the tin roof. It was a sound that felt like safety, like a final, definitive cleansing. She thought of her grandmother's last, cryptic words, "Make it quick inside." She finally understood. It wasn't just about the safe. It was about life itself. It was a warning against letting fear fester, against allowing a lie to take root and grow in the dark, secret places of the heart. It was a plea to find the truth, to embrace what was real and good, and to do it quickly, before the world had a chance to build a prison around you, to live, and to do it with urgency. In the main room, Calder could not sleep. He stood at the window, watching the rain slant down in the faint moonlight, turning the ranch yard into a landscape of silver and shadow. He felt a quiet he had not known since before the collapse. It was not the empty, sterile quiet of grief, but a deep, peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a long and terrible fever has finally broken. He moved to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, bringing a gentle, pulsing glow back to the room. He filled the coffee pot with water from the pump and measured out the dark, fragrant grounds. The simple, domestic act felt unfamiliar, a ritual from a life he had forgotten how to live. He heard a soft sound behind him and turned. Mara was standing in the doorway, wrapped in the wool blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders. She had not been able to sleep either. She came and sat in the chair by the fire, her bare feet tucked underneath her. Calder poured the coffee into 2 tin mugs. He handed one to her and took the other for himself, sitting down in the chair opposite hers. The rich, dark aroma of the coffee mingled with the clean, earthy smell of the rain. They sat there for a long time as the rain drummed on the roof. They did not speak. There were no words for what had passed between them, for the shared trial of fire and truth. The silence was not empty. It was a language in itself, a space filled with a profound and unspoken understanding. In the comfortable quiet, with the storm washing the world clean outside and the warm fire glowing between them, the space was the first foundation of whatever was to be built next. The dawn that followed the rain was a revelation. It arrived not as a whisper of gray, but as a quiet explosion of color and scent. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a high, cloudless dome of the palest, most delicate blue. The sun crested the eastern ridge and spilled a light that was not the hard, unforgiving glare of the day before, but a soft, golden wash that seemed to heal the very land it touched. The oppressive red dust that had coated every surface, that had lived in the back of every throat, was gone. In its place was the deep, rich, and almost forgotten smell of clean, damp earth. It was the smell of life itself. And for the first time in years, there was green on the long dormant pasture lands, tiny, impossibly vibrant shoots of new grass had pushed their way through the softened soil, a faint but determined emerald haze against the dark, wet ground. The valley, which had been a study in shades of brown and gray, was blushing with the promise of new life. The curse had held the land in a state of perpetual, dusty autumn. The truth had brought the spring. In the town square, the transformation was just as profound. The ground, once a dry, packed expanse of dirt, was now dark and soft. The circle of salt, the ugly scar of the town's fear, had vanished without a trace, dissolved and reclaimed by the earth. In its place, a group of men, their faces set with a quiet, solemn purpose, were hammering a new sign into the ground. It was made of fresh-cut pine, the wood still pale and smelling of resin. The old, weathered sign that had welcomed travelers to Dustfall Flats lay discarded nearby. The new one, its letters carefully painted in bold, black strokes, offered a different identity, a new covenant. It read, Dustfall Flats, a town that lives by truth. The rhythmic, solid sound of the hammer driving the post home was not a sound of judgment or violence. It was the sound of a foundation being laid. Out at the edge of the Rook Ranch, where the pasture met the rising slope of the hills, Calder led a gentle-eyed mare. She was a calm, steady creature, the kind of horse a man would choose for a child's first lesson. The saddle on her back was small, finely tooled, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship he had finished years ago and then stored away in the darkest corner of his tack room. Unable to look at it, he ran his hand over the polished leather, then checked the length of the stirrups, adjusting them with a practiced, meticulous care. He was setting them for a small rider, a novice. He was setting them to the length they would have been for his son, Aaron, a detail of paternal love for a moment that had never come to pass. The act was a quiet acknowledgement of the ghost that would always ride beside him. But now, for the first time, it was a memory that brought a deep, aching sadness, not a sharp, bitter rage. Mara stood waiting, her expression a mixture of apprehension and a quiet, determined curiosity. She had faced down a mob and a man with a gun. Now she faced 1,000 pounds of animal, and it seemed, in its own way, just as daunting. "Her name is Grace," Calder said, his voice soft. He stroked the mare's neck, his touch reassuring both the horse and the woman. "She'll take care of you." He showed her how to mount, his instructions simple and clear. His hands guided her, one on her elbow, the other supporting her as she swung her leg over the saddle. She landed awkwardly, her body stiff and unbalanced. For a moment, she felt a surge of panic, the world seeming to tilt precariously from her high vantage point. She swayed, her hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity. But Calder was there. He didn't grab her or pull her back. He simply moved alongside the horse, his presence a solid, calming anchor. He placed his large, warm hand on her knee, his touch gentle but firm, a point of stability in her uncertain world. He began to walk, leading the horse in a slow, easy circle. "Breathe," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "Don't fight her. Feel her rhythm. Let her carry you." Mara closed her eyes for a second, forcing the tension from her shoulders, forcing herself to do as he said. She felt the slow, steady rocking motion of the horse's gait, the power in the muscles moving beneath her. She began to move with the horse, not against it. Her grip on the saddle horn relaxed. When she opened her eyes, the world had stopped tilting. She was unsteady, but she was riding. Calder kept his hand on her knee, his long strides easily keeping pace with the walking horse. They moved in a wide circle on the damp, greening earth, the only two people in a world that felt brand new. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only by the soft thud of the horse's hooves and the distant, melodic sound of a hammer on wood drifting up from the town below. He looked up at the mountain, at the sealed entrance to the mine, now just a dark patch on the vast, greening canvas of the hillside. His gaze was clear, stripped of the hatred that had clouded it for so long. "I used to stand here," he said, his voice quiet, almost a confession to the horse and the sky, "and I'd look at that mountain, and I'd think that the earth itself hated me, I thought it had a soul, a dark one, and that it had opened up just to take my family, just to spite me. He looked at his own hand, resting on her knee, a point of connection to another living, breathing person. But that's not it. The earth doesn't hate. It just is. He finally turned his gaze from the mountain to her, and his eyes were filled with a raw, difficult truth. Turns out, I was the one doing all the hating. I just hated myself. Mara looked down at him, at his strong, weathered profile, at the pain and acceptance that now lived side by side in his eyes. She thought of her grandmother's fear, of the town's long sickness, of his own frozen grief. She thought of the threads of lies and secrets that had been woven into the fabric of this place, creating a tapestry of sorrow. "We don't get to tear out the past," she said softly, her words a quiet reply to his confession. "The stitches are too deep. All we can do is try to stitch it back together with a true thread." From the valley below, the sound of the hammering continued, a steady, hopeful beat. They were not just building a sign, they were rebuilding a town. They were driving new, honest nails into new, solid beams. It was the music of people starting over. They completed another circle, Mara's balance more confident now, her body moving in easy rhythm with the horse. Calder slowed the mare to a halt. He stood before her, his hand still resting on her knee. He looked up at her, and then he reached out and gently touched his forehead to the horse's soft, broad forehead, a gesture of quiet communion. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he looked at Mara, and he smiled. It was a rare and astonishing thing, a sight as new and as welcome as the green shoots on the hills. It was not a wide grin, but a small, slow lifting at the corners of his mouth, a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the sun-weathered skin around them. It was a smile that held all the pain of the past 5 years, and all the fragile hope of the next 5 minutes. It was like watching a window that had been nailed shut for a generation finally being pried open to a different season. Seeing his smile, feeling the warmth of it, Mara felt her own heart settle. The purpose that had driven her here, the frantic, urgent need to deliver her grandmother's message, had been fulfilled. Now, in its place, a new, quieter purpose was beginning to take root. She thought of the words that had been her guide, the cryptic phrase that had been both a map and a mystery, and she understood them now, in a way her grandmother perhaps never had. She leaned down slightly, her voice a clear, soft whisper, not a fever dream, but a statement of intent, a philosophy for the road ahead. "Go deeper," she said, her eyes holding his, "into what is good." She paused, and then added the final, crucial instruction, "and make it quick, before fear has time to find a new name." He held her gaze, and in the quiet understanding that passed between them, a new story began. They rode out from the ranch, not back toward the town, but onto the high trail that led into the heart of the mountains. The path was cool and damp from the rain, and the air smelled of wet pine and clean stone. The imaginary camera of the mind pulls back, leaving the 2 small figures on horseback to move through the vast, breathing landscape. The charm is broken. The curse is shattered in the clear morning light. Hope, which had been a buried seed, now stands tall and straight and green, like the endless rows of pine trees that guard the high ridges. There is still a long road ahead, a lifetime of stitching to be done, but for the first time in a very long time, in a town that has chosen truth over comfort, they know the direction. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm always curious to know where these tales travel, so please, leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from. It's wonderful to connect with you all and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support the channel, hitting that hype button helps this story reach more listeners just like you.